I do have skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
Thank you, Mr. Merrick.
Yes, thank you, sir. Now we'll now turn to you, Dr. Rapsey, and we'll follow this same process as we did with Professor Taryn Sweeney. At tab 22 of the folder in front of you, if you can open to tab 22, can we see there a signed copy of your brief of evidence?
That is correct.
And do you confirm that that's true and correct?
I do.
With the proviso that at paragraph 23 there is a point that you would like to clarify around the brief at that point, and we can do that in your oral evidence. Correct?
Yes, correct. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll invite you to start by reading your brief of evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Psychological Medicine, University of Otago, and a registered clinical psychologist. My research interests include mental disorder and the effects of childhood adversity. While in practice, I have worked as an ACC-approved clinical psychologist, and at times this has included working with incarcerated men who were victims of sexual abuse, as well as with children in foster care. This work also included working with those where the abuse occurred in state care, and so I bring an understanding of the issues faced by survivors of abuse in state care. My current research projects include the World Health Organization World Mental Health Surveys project. This is a unique international collaboration with over 30 countries focused on epidemiology and the prevention of mental disorder. The Otago Women's Health Study, a 25-year longitudinal study investigating associations between childhood abuse and outcomes across the life course. And the Foster the Whānau project, which investigates the costs, benefits, and long-term outcomes for children when the mother participates in an intensive residential intervention as an alternative to foster care. First, I am proud that our government has chosen to commission this royal inquiry into abuse in care. Today, the evidence I am presenting is based on my summary of the research field, primarily addressing the question posed by the Commission: what are the effects of abuse? In this brief, I have used the word maltreatment as a term that includes physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, as well as neglect. I'm going to discuss evidence addressing the following 4 questions. What are the effects of childhood maltreatment? What are the effects of time in out-of-home care, that is foster care or institutional care? And specifically, what are the effects for children in Aotearoa, New Zealand? What is the effect on the family and the likelihood of family reunification when a child has been removed into care? And what evidence supports alternatives to out-of-home care? So beginning with the first question, what are the effects of child maltreatment? There is strong and robust evidence that all forms of child maltreatment are associated with an increased risk of deleterious outcomes across the lifespan of the individual.
And by deleterious,
Bad, poor, reduced,
thank you.
yeah. The magnitude of risk of poor outcomes increases with increasing exposure to maltreatment and/or the increasing severity of the abuse. So that is cumulative maltreatment and/or higher levels of abuse harm are associated with increasingly greater risk of poor outcomes. The effects of child maltreatment are pervasive, with disruption of multiple interacting systems: biological, psychological, relational, and social. This pervasive disruption influences development in multiple ways, with long-term implications across the life course. Psychological effects of maltreatment include an increased risk of meeting diagnostic criteria for all types of mental disorder. As an example, the WHO World Mental Health Surveys, which is the largest international survey of mental disorders, conducted an analysis of the relationship between childhood adversity and adult mental disorder, which included almost 52,000 participants from 21 countries, including Aotearoa, New Zealand. They assessed diagnosis of 20 commonly occurring mental disorders. So that includes depressive disorders, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder, phobias, generalised anxiety disorder, behaviour disorders, and examples of behaviour disorders are conduct disorder, ADHD, as well as substance abuse disorders, so alcohol and drug. They did this using a clinical interview. They found that childhood maltreatment increased the risk of meeting criteria for all types of mental disorder at all ages. In this study, they also analysed the extent to which childhood adversity contributed to the prevalence of mental disorder in a country. They reported that eradication of childhood adversity would lead to a 23% reduction in mood disorders, a 31% reduction in anxiety disorders, a 42% reduction in behaviour disorders, and a 28% reduction in substance disorders. So overall, eradication of childhood adversity would lead to a 30% reduction in all mental disorders. So this study, the World Mental Health Surveys, did not assess psychosis, but other research has found that childhood maltreatment increases the risk of psychosis. Childhood maltreatment increases the risk of death by suicide and suicidal behaviours. This increased risk of mental disorder persists across the life course of an individual. In addition to an increased risk of mental disorder, child maltreatment affects physical health. Child maltreatment is associated with an increased risk of a number of chronic diseases and the associated disability and loss of quality of life. For example, there is an increased risk of a range of physical health problems, including pulmonary, cardiovascular, gastrointestinal disease, musculoskeletal problems, chronic pain, and cancer. Specifically, in the World Health Organization World Mental Health Surveys, child maltreatment was associated with an increased risk of all 6 of the measured physical health conditions. They were heart disease, asthma, diabetes mellitus, arthritis, chronic spinal pain, and chronic headache. Childhood physical and emotional abuse is associated with an increased risk of all-cause early mortality for women. Maltreatment in childhood also has implications for relational and social outcomes. Effects include increased risk of sexual and physical re-victimization, a greater likelihood of developing insecure attachment styles, which are associated with later relationship difficulties, and diminished educational and employment opportunities. This diminished social and economic capital also has implications for reduced mental and physical health. There are a number of proposed mechanisms that contribute to understanding why child maltreatment increases the risk of poor physical and mental health. Research focused on biological mechanisms finds that there are neurological changes that can occur in adverse environments. In particular, there is evidence that child maltreatment can lead to altered hypothalamic pituitary adrenal stress response networks, the HPA network. The HPA axis is involved in the fight or flight response. So fight or flight is a useful system to get us out of danger quickly. It's a complex system that also regulates immune functioning and inflammatory processes. One theory suggests that child maltreatment alters the HPA system so that it is more sensitive to stresses, to dangers in the environment. So while the physiological mechanisms involved in a stress response are valuable and useful for short-term dangers, persistent and chronic exposure to stress is associated with a range of poor outcomes. So coming to the question, what outcomes are associated with time in out-of-home care, so that's foster care or institutional care? We would expect that removing children from adverse home environments and placing them in out-of-home care should improve outcomes for children who have experienced maltreatment. However, when children are removed from parental care due to maltreatment, they remain at increased risk of experiencing a number of poor outcomes, including mental and physical illness, poorer educational outcomes, and greater contact with justice and child protection services. So when compared with children from similar backgrounds, so taking into account to the extent that's possible, that children in care are at greater risk of poor outcomes because they come from backgrounds of adversity, some studies suggest that outcomes are not improved and may even deteriorate for some children in care. So, for example, children who go into unfamiliar foster homes can experience a greater increase in mental and behavioural problems than children who remain in maltreating homes, but maltreating homes that are not at the level for the children, to the extent that the children would be removed into foster care. So this is the point I wanted to clarify, that children in severely maltreating homes should be removed from that harm. The point to take from this research is that foster care is not reparative for many children. One factor that contributes to poorer outcomes is placement instability. When in care, New Zealand children typically experience 7 to 8 placement moves by the time they are 8 years of age. There is evidence from a number of studies that placement instability is associated with a greater risk of mental distress and symptoms of mental disorder. Attachment theory and research present a compelling argument for the necessity of consistent, loving, and responsive caregiving, and thus the likelihood that placement disruption will have devastating consequences for a young person's development. In support of the argument that placement instability contributes to an increase in problems, children who go into foster care with average levels of mental and behavioural health problems are most likely to experience an increase in problems following placement stability. So that is, it's not just that children with pre-existing difficulties are more likely to experience placement disruption at first. Children placed in residential care, so group homes and institutional care, have worse mental and behavioural health outcomes than children placed in family-based foster care. And by family-based foster care, I mean unfamiliar family-based foster care, not to imply kinship care. When children and young people are asked their perspectives on going into care, many children reported missing their mothers and reporting that their lives would have been better or the same if they had stayed with their families. Young people report preferring family-based foster care to residential care. Specifically, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, children who were in the care of child, youth and family, now Oranga Tamariki, are at greater risk of experiencing a number of adverse outcomes, including higher engagement with youth justice and correction, poorer educational achievement, and poorer mental health when compared to children who have no contact with SIFs, child, youth and family. Women with contact with child, youth and family as children are nearly 3 times more likely to be parents before age 25, and as parents are 3 times more likely to have their child referred to child, youth and family. So a set of analyses of a cohort of children born in 1990-1991 found those children who were ever placed in child, youth and family care were twice as likely to fail NCEA Level 2. So 78% left school with less than NCEA Level 2, compared with 36% of children with no contact with SIFs. They were 10 times more likely to have been in prison before age 21. So 18% compared to 2% of all children. They were more than twice as likely to have a mental disorder. 5 out of 10 had identified mental health issues, compared to 2 out of every 10 who did not have contact with child, youth and family. Maori children are particularly affected. Maori children were significantly more likely to have a hospital admission arising from assault, neglect or maltreatment. 6 out of 10 children in foster care are Maori. Intervention practices with a narrow focus on child removal do not address structural barriers, systemic racism, and can further perpetuate harm through a placement that does not ensure cultural continuity. Moreover, a focus on risk and individualistic child protection policies conflicts with ways of knowing embedded in Indigenous identity and values of Māori within Aotearoa, New Zealand. My research most often focuses on statistics and the increased probability of risk. But behind these numbers are the stories of individuals. I have also worked as a clinical psychologist and heard and read in their files some of the stories of individuals who grew up in care. Some historic files contain accounts of boys who spent time in multiple group homes until the state relinquished responsibility for them when they turned 15, leaving them with few resources. At the time that I was talking with them, these men were incarcerated. It has seemed to me that as a society, we failed in our care of these men when they were children in our state-mandated children's homes. We placed these children in institutional care, then failed to provide adequate care, and then again placed them in the institutional control of prisons when they went on to commit crimes that hurt others. So my third question: what is the effect on the family and the likelihood of family reunification when a child has been removed into care? In addition to research finding poor outcomes for children removed into foster care, there is evidence that removal of children into care has poor outcomes for the mother, which ultimately has implications for her children. Qualitative evidence describes mother-child separation as a traumatic event that involves the devastating grief of losing a child, loss of identity as a mother, and the added assault of stigma and the societal invalidation of such a loss. Not only does a parent experience the loss of a child, but they experience guilt and marginalisation at being blamed for that loss. Internationally, quantitative evidence finds that compared with mothers in the general population, mothers whose children were taken into care had higher rates of mental disorder, housing instability, and poverty prior to having their children removed, which is what we would expect. But this inequity increased in the 2 years after having a child taken into care. So when mental health and structural factors that contributed to the initial removal of a child are intensified following the removal of a child, family reunification, and thus ultimately the child's welfare, is undermined. So my final question: what evidence supports alternatives to out-of-home care? In Aotearoa, New Zealand, the recent government-commissioned review of then Child, Youth and Family, Modernising Child, Youth and Family, concluded that the current system of foster care provision was failing to provide adequate care and protection of our most vulnerable children. Therefore, to improve outcomes for children and mothers in the context of child welfare concerns, effective alternatives to our current out-of-home placement system are needed. Broadly, there is some international evidence that interventions to reduce child maltreatment, broadly, can be effective. Larger effect sizes, that means that the most impact was seen for interventions that provided social and emotional support. Consistent with this research focused on the importance of attachment relationships The Modernising Child, Youth and Family report identified that supporting families to care for their children was a key principle that should underpin interventions. So a family preservation intervention is an intervention that aims to reduce child maltreatment and other care and protection concerns in order to avoid out-of-home placement. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, at least 2 organisations, the Anglican Trust for Women and Children and the Maryvale Whānau Development Centre, offer residential family preservation interventions that aim to avoid parent-child separation. These 2 similarly structured services offer an intensive 6 to 18-month support program whereby the mother and the children in her care are placed in residential care together. During the intervention, the mother and her children participate in a therapeutic and parenting skills-focused program aimed at changing the factors associated with care and protection concerns. A qualitative evaluation of one of these Aotearoa-based family preservation services was undertaken by my team. We found that service users and staff provided hopeful stories that included the centrality and importance of relationships, the development of practical skills and psychological resources through participation in a wraparound, holistic program, described by many of the participants and the staff as being like a family. The reports from these women and from the staff contrasted markedly with qualitative reports of women's experiences with child welfare services. The stories told in our study suggest that a relational and skills-based program within a supportive residential community environment has the potential to change the lives of women and children. Internationally, few studies have investigated longer-term residential programs, and so we have minimal robust evidence to be able to comment or determine effectiveness. Robust research directly assessing the effect of family preservation interventions is limited, but indicates some components may reduce out-of-home placements for some children. So further research, and particularly quantitative research, is necessary to investigate whether participation in this Aotearoa-based family preservation program results in reduced risk of future out-of-home placements, along with improved outcomes for children. It is time to change the focus of child welfare interventions from one that focuses only on the child and the child's risk to a new paradigm that understands that parent and child well-being are interrelated. The stories of service users and of staff suggest that there is some value in pursuing a paradigm that supports and fosters family resilience.
Kia ora, thank you for that. Now, Mr. Chair, I've had discussions with Council about possible questioning. I have a couple of questions to put. I will put on behalf of Ms. McCartney, and then, so I understand it, Mr. Stone may or may not have questions in light of Dr. Rapsey's evidence, but we can confirm that. If I can put these questions first, and that's to you, Professor Taryn Sweeney. And the first question relates to, briefly, what happened with children in New South Wales who were moved out of residential homes into the community as a result of that radical move of shutting down residential homes.
So that occurred in the 1990s, following the Usher inquiry, Usher report. It was Father John Usher was the man that did that, led that inquiry. every residential facility, from the largest residential institutions to the smallest group homes, were closed. There were no exceptions. And so with such a radical change, there were, of course, some negative outcomes from that for specific children. But in the main, it was a brave and positive move, because it forced cultural change, and it forced a way of thinking afresh around how to care for difficult to place children. New South Wales at the time had a parallel funded service for young people, teenagers who were run away from home or for homeless. There was a youth refuge system. And so for a time, for several years, many of those young people, though mostly adolescents, that were very difficult to place, found themselves living in the youth refuges for periods of time. Over time, there was a very small number of young people that could never be successfully placed with families, and over time the government relented and gradually started to reintroduce funded residential placements. And so I think it was in the 2000s that happened, and so particularly organisations like Life Without Barriers, who I think work here in New Zealand as well, started to be allowed to provide small group homes for those most difficult to place kids. And
was that monitored by the child protection?
It was. So they were. Yeah. So it was oversight. They were licensed by the State Child Welfare Authority, but also there was oversight by the Children's Guardian. But I think the important thing is that even though residential care has been reintroduced in New South Wales, the numbers of children in residential care and young people is far, far lower than it was previously. And so on the positive side, it affected positive change, because it forced the state to think about how could we place young people, mostly adolescents, and some children who historically and traditionally were seen as being unfosterable. How can we actually make that happen? And so I think that in the process of being forced to do that because of this quite radical change, excuse me, the state had to learn ways of doing this in terms of training particular caregivers, foster carers, to be able to take specific, very difficult to care for young people and children. And often those were placements where there was only one child or one young person placed. And there was definitely a financial cost to this, because the level of resourcing and the level of support and training and ongoing assistance required to support these placements is quite expensive. But bearing in mind that we're talking about a relatively small number of children in care that this applies to.
Thank you. I'll move on to the other bigger question that I've been referred, and that's seeking some clarification or reconciling your earlier evidence that statutory care exposes children and young persons to developmental risks, alongside this tension that you both talked about, that it's against the interests of children to remain in environments involving serious maltreatment. And so the question was, how do you reconcile the two? And it may have something to do with what you talked about being two bad choices, but I'll leave it to you to answer.
Well, there are two solutions, and they are not mutually exclusive, and they shouldn't run in conflict with each other or seen as opposing choices. In other words, there is a kind of a perception that there's a false dichotomy between family preservation and permanency, permanent placements. And there doesn't need to be. It's not paradoxical that the state could both be investing more efforts into family. Sorry, excuse me, just too much talking. There we go. The state should be at the same time investing more efforts into not only funding family preservation interventions, but I think more importantly, funding research into finding effective family parenting interventions. In other words, developing interventions that actually work to reduce maltreatment to the point that children don't need to come into care. At the same time, we have to recognise that even if we got to that utopian point where we were able to develop interventions that dramatically reduced children's exposure to harm, there would always be some children that need to come into care. And so the other point is that if for those children, for those small number of children who cannot be raised by their parents, the point that I'm trying to emphasise is that they need to be raised by someone else, not by the state. And so I see statutory care or state care as really, it should only exist for strictly temporary, for children who need temporary care. No child should grow up in statutory care in this situation that's extremely unnatural and harmful for their development. So I don't actually see those two endeavours as being contradictory. I see them as being complementary. However, I think in practice, if we look around the world, the bigger difficulty is social workers being able to simultaneously, philosophically be able to be comfortable with both those positions. In practice, it's very difficult. People tend to, we see, for example, in Scandinavia, which has the strongest and highest level of family preservation resourcing and the strongest commitment to family preservation resourcing, that because the philosophy is so strong, that those social workers that work in that system find it very difficult then to raise their hand and say, these children need to be in care. In other words, it becomes difficult for people who are investing from a philosophical and from their hearts into a system of supporting and improving families so that children can remain with their families. It's very difficult for those people to simultaneously be the person that says, look, these children's experience of maltreatment is ongoing, it is severe, and what happens sometimes in Scandinavia is that social workers then become complicit in children being maltreated and not being responded to.
Well, that covers that group of questions, I think, and I'll leave it now to you, Mr. Chair, to see if Mr. Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Merrick. I'm now, Professor and Doctor, going to ask if any of the other council wish to address questions to you. Mr. Stone, please come forward.
Tēnā kōrua. I act for Dr. Lynn Russell. She's the named claimant for a claim currently with the Waitangi Tribunal. Her wide number is 2684. In her claim, she says that Māori who are entering into prisons actually have mental health issues, and that a large number of them are going into prison because they're not getting their health care met before they enter, and then once they're in prison, they're not getting the care they need there either. And then when they're released, again, they're not receiving the mental health care that they need, and they subsequently reoffend and enter back into prison again. So they are on this perpetual merry-go-round. I was interested in your evidence because it reinforced this report that I read recently, which said that entering into state care is a gateway to criminal offending. And Professor, you said before that a quarter of children, I think you used the term, travel well and don't need monitoring. That means then that there's, 75% of them don't travel well and need help.
Yes.
And you said that the Crown has 3 duties, the last of which was to provide specialised clinical support, and that they're not really getting that, and that the process is to get them in and to get them out as quickly as possible.
Yes, the existing mental health services are not designed for children in care or for maltreated children. They're designed for the community at large. And because the demand for services is so high and the waiting times are so high, there's such a long wait list, the government prioritises psychological treatments that are relatively brief and rapid rather than longer term, so that they can get more throughput, so more children can access the services. But that very approach doesn't work well for these children.
So can we say then that the Crown is failing these people at every level? It's failing them as children placed in care. It's failing them as young adults. It's failing them as adults and as inmates, and failing them once they get out.
I think it's this is a really good example of how if the Crown were to address the core problems of these children's development lives at the earliest possible time in their lives, not only would they save those children's lives and save future generations' lives, but they would prevent so many consequential effects that affect everyone and which add to the cost for society in terms of provisions of services. And so this is a really clear example of where early decisive intervention, doing the right thing, even if it's costly, saves many things, not least of which is that we don't have as many lives destroyed.
If the Minister of Corrections were here today and he said to you, look, I'd like to build bigger prisons, what would you have to say about that?
I'm not sure that that's an area that I would have expertise in, but I think that what this kind of puts a light on is the idea that this is actually something that requires a whole of government approach, because you see, the Minister of Corrections is only thinking about the particular concern that the Corrections Department has. It doesn't necessarily make sense that corrections goes into the business of children's social work or mental health services, but a government at large can be thinking about this strategically. For example, in New South Wales, one of the things I didn't say that actually led to increased provision of mental health services for children in care was that government introduced a thing called Best Endeavours legislation, or Best Endeavours law. And what the law said was that children in state care, by virtue of the fact that not only was those children's guardianship legally transferred to the state, but as a society, when we remove children from their parents' care, we as a society then have to take on a duty of care and a degree of responsibility for children's lives that other families don't share. And so best endeavours legislation says that if a child is in care, they go to the top of the queue for the waiting list for any government service, whether it be educational services, social work services, mental health services, or even services that may prevent young people from offending and coming into youth justice. And so that became law, and because the law says you have to do that, it's like submitting a freedom of information request. Social workers would submit a best endeavours request to their child mental health service, which places that child at the top of the queue.
Professor, Ms. Ramsey, Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stone. Any other counsel? There being none, I'll then ask my colleagues if they have any questions of either the Professor or Dr. Rapsey. Starting with you, Dr. Aotearoa.
Tēnā kōrua. So my questions, I've got a couple. One relates to your research, Professor Charlene Sweeney, which would suggest the need for early intervention, if there's a notification, say, which would seem to create a kind of heightened sense or heightened level of anxiety, I suppose, around children at that young age. I'm curious about whether that has the potential of creating an environment where there might be a targeting of particular groups, and there's some tension here between that intervention, heightened intervention, and the possibility of groups being stigmatised and targeted, as we've seen in history. And Professor Stanley yesterday talked about even benign interventions actually having long-term detrimental effects. I'm just wondering, I suppose it's the type of intervention that you were talking about earlier that's important, right?
Yeah. So the developmental sciences are unequivocal. So the more severe maltreatment that children experience, and the longer that experience it over time, the greater the harm that's done to them. And so we can't kind of will that away. That's just a fact. And so if we then think about, what is our responsibility as a society, or even within family, within whānau, then when we know that children are experiencing, and I'm not talking about the large number of New Zealand children that are known to Oranga Tamariki. I'm talking about the most serious cases here. It's about having being able to have the means to more clearly identify which of these children we need to be focusing on the most. The problem that you allude to around institutional abuse of power to some extent, racism, bias, these are problems that I don't have any expertise in, or I don't really have an answer to, other than the fact that that in identifying a policy need like I have done here, it's important not to believe then that it's a straightforward matter of achieving that. And so we can say more clearly that developmental science says we need to find the children who are being harmed the most as early as we can, and to work out whether we're providing enough support or services for their family in order for those children to be able to remain with their family, or whether in fact they need to come into care. And one of the larger impacts that happens for these children is when we don't do that. Because children that experience really severe maltreatment for long periods of time, coming into care for example, at age 8 or 9 or 10, are in such poor shape psychologically that it's really asking a lot of us to be able to work out how we can then repair that within the short space of time that's left of their childhood. But I think what you're talking about is a really important point, and that is that we can have a clear idea. This idea to me is crystal clear, but when you go to try to kind of implement that idea, just as I've alluded to all sorts of systemic problems within the care system, there are potentially systemic problems within the child protection system, which is within the same ministry, but child protection, remember, is a different part of Oranga Timariki compared and as distinct from out-of-home care. Yeah. So I don't have an answer for you, but I think it's a valid concern.
I did wonder too if you could elaborate some more about the specialist services that should be provided to children in statutory care, which you referenced also the cultural needs that they might have. To what extent do we have those services available here in New Zealand today? Are there models, or are we forced to look to Australia, like New South Wales, for inspiration?
There's nowhere in the world that does it very well. There are some examples that I can refer to, but what's really interesting is even in the United Kingdom, where they seem to have done the best, this never came out of a central government policy change or initiative. Most of these services arose from the ground up because dynamic clinicians, visionary clinicians decided we needed this. In Glasgow, for example, I believe there were 5 or 6 child and adolescent mental health services, government ones within the National Health Service, and a group of clinical staff that specialised themselves individually in working in this area came together and said, look, we want to do this better. And so they managed to do a restructure within the Glasgow services so that one of them was set up just for children in care and maltreated children, and then the clinicians that worked in the 6 services that specialised in this work all came to that one service. And not only that, we're finding that with this service and others, they're best if they are co-located with child welfare services. And so they then moved that new specialised service into a building in one of the most impoverished parts of Glasgow, so it was not fancy, and they co-located with the child welfare service. And the reason for that is that a lot of the nature of this specialised work is not just about the clinical work, it's about how those specialised services can shape casework. And so it's realising that some of the best ways that we can use this specialised knowledge is to guide social workers and what they're doing, rather than providing some kind of magic treatment that will fix this problem. There is no magic treatment. If there is one, it's just really stability and love. And so it's helping social workers work out how to do that and to kind of try to ward off things like moving children from one place to another.
Thank you, Professor. I really appreciate that, because me and my colleagues have been spending a lot of time in private sessions hearing about, in foster care, about children being repeatedly moved from one home to the next, many dozens of homes, more, and hearing about the long-term effects that has had on these survivors. I have one last question for Professor Rapsey. It's about the last comment you were talking to, describe them as family preservation interventions. I was really fascinated by that, but it seems that there's very little research today, quantitative research, you said.
That's right, yeah. Yes. So we can theorise that family stability is optimal, and if you can intervene sufficiently with that family of origin to ameliorate those care and protection concerns that would have otherwise led to those children going into foster care. And you can prevent that additional harm that goes from that initial separation, then that will have better outcomes for children and for their families. But we don't have any actual evidence to support that.
Is that research that you're undertaking?
I am, yes. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the IDI, the integrated data. Yes. So I am waiting, I'm on the list to use that data to investigate the children whose mothers had gone through these services. What were their outcomes in terms of this really big, imprecise measurement? We can't measure their developmental outcomes, but we can measure their outcomes in terms of, did they then go on and end up in foster care anyway? Was this intervention, did it just stall the process? Or did those children, and potentially additional children that mother might go on to have, were they then protected from going into a system that might then have involved multiple placements? So that's the first step in terms of the effectiveness of this program, and looking at the health, other outcomes as well, as much as we can with this clunky data that we have.
Thank you, Judge Shaw.
Tēnā kōrua. Thank you both for your evidence. I've got two questions that arise from what my colleagues just referred to, and that's the private sessions which the commissioners have been undertaking, speaking with individual survivors. And we've heard from current up to the stage from about 200 individuals. And we have, over the last days of this hearing, heard from individual survivors. One of the horrifying things that many of these say is that they did not feel as though they were treated as humans. They were not being treated as human beings. And they say that in many ways, but I think that just summarises what they felt. Listening to your evidence today seems to me to suggest maybe why they felt that. And for you, Professor Taryn Sweeney, you spoke of loss of attachment of love, loss of the permanent family. Could this be why they felt as though they were not being treated as human?
Perhaps many of the people that you've been speaking to privately were in residential settings, but perhaps also with families as well. And sometimes we can overthink this, but for me, I often just try to imagine myself, or the thing that I keep saying to try and shift people's thinking is, what is it that you would want for your own child or for your own grandchildren? Does it meet that standard? And the first thing is, no one would ever want their own child or their own grandchild to be raised in an institution. Not because an institution's got a bad reputation or a bad name, but because institutions, as good as they can be in terms of the absolute best types of institutions that have ever existed, the childhood, or the experience that a child has in growing up in an institution, as I said right at the end of my evidence, I think goes beyond the limits of human adaptation. It goes beyond the limits to which we've evolved as a species, which is that at its very core, we are a social species, and at the very core of that social aspect is family. And if you read between the lines, my way of thinking about family is quite fluid. It's not necessarily tied to blood, but it's certainly about how we feel and the strength of relationships. And so that really is, that's why institutional care, there are almost no chances. There are very rare cases of where children may have bonded very closely to a residential care worker, but if they're working shifts, you know, it's... And then for foster care, I think the experiences of growing up in foster care are actually are much more varied than what I've explained today. And there's a risk in reading my evidence that that you would go away thinking that all foster care is bad. In fact, I've worked for many years of my life was spent working with foster carers, and some of the foster carers that I've worked with are amongst the best people I've ever met in my life, and quite inspirational. And their capacity for love and for giving love to children and their commitment to them is phenomenal. But by and large, most foster carers' commitment to the children that they raise is conditional. And it's conditional by virtue of this contract. And so we can have a situation where foster parents can be as good as any parents that exist. And yet the nature of the relationship and the longer term commitment is qualified.
So when survivors say, was it my fault that I wasn't treated as a human being? What would you say to them?
And well, first of all, I would say to them, I can understand why they believe that, even though it's not true.
Yes. And that's the important thing.
Yeah.
It's not true, is it?
It's not true. And there, but for the grace of God, go us, right? I mean, and every one of us is born the same and equally. I believe that the vast majority of negative feelings that people have for themselves are acquired after birth, not because of genetics or other things like that. And so, and in that respect, children in care are, as a result of two things. One, the experiences that they had before they came to care, and secondly, the experiences they have in care, often have very, very negative self-image. They see themselves sometimes as being essentially unlovable. And they also have similar distortions in how they recognise and perceive the people that are trying to care for them. And so, on the one hand, sometimes the care that they're getting is not good enough, or it's qualified, but also how they perceive that and understand it and reconstruct it is often distorted. So it's definitely not their fault.
I think it's important that
Yeah.
you say it is definitely not
And
their
the
fault.
reason, and one of the reasons, the problem with placement breakdowns and placement instability is that it's typically constructed in terms of the placement breakdown because this child's behaviour was too difficult. Now, at the face value, that may be the case, that the foster parent says, I can't care for this child because their behaviour is so difficult. But the way the child then reflects on that and perceives that is, this is confirmation of my own belief of myself as being unlovable and bad. And they don't have the ability, and neither do the foster parents, of actually understanding and making sense of how it came to this.
Yes, thank you for that, and that leads me directly into Dr. Rapsey's evidence, because you listed in paragraph 10, all of the commonly occurring mental disorders that were suffered by children. And again, just bringing it back to a survivor perspective for a moment, so many say, well, I was a naughty kid. I was being naughty.
Yeah.
They punished me because I was naughty. Yeah. And it just struck me that what they felt was, in a blaming way, was their own fault, in fact, could well be explained by the matters in your paragraph 10 and probably other things as well.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I think what we all try to make sense of our world, and one of the ways that children in care can do that is to make it, how do I understand why I'm in this situation? Well, it must be something that I have done. And children will do that even if that's not told to them explicitly. But certainly in the historical files that I've reviewed, there is that impression, well, that explicit message that comes through from workers at the time that it is naughty behaviour, which is an abhorrent sort of an interpretation to us now or to myself, because whatever that outcome is, whether it is a greater likelihood of experiencing depression or anxiety, whether it's a greater likelihood of becoming incarcerated, those things are a result of a person adapting to the best of their ability to the situation that they are in, the way that any of us would adapt if we were in that situation. It's quite clear what the drivers of, what it is that leads a person to that end outcome, and it's certainly not because of any fault or inherent capacity of that individual. So yes, so both that experience of mental disorder is likely a normal and a person doing the best that they can do to survive in an impossible situation, as well as contributing to their impression that it's something that's also going on at the time. If they're experiencing a mental disorder, then that's going to contribute to their behaviour.
Thank you for that answer. I have a quick question of detail for you from your paragraph 32, where you're talking about the Aotearoa New Zealand experience, and particularly Māori children. There you say that Māori children were significantly more likely to have a hospital admission arising from maltreatment than European children. You say that in the context of, you start by talking about New Zealand children who were in the care of child, youth and family. Is your statement there in paragraph 32, does that relate to all Māori children, or only those who've had contact with or were in the care of SIFs or rangatamariki?
I understand that applies to all children, but that's part of why they come into contact with rangatamariki.
Because in paragraph 29, so New Zealand children who are in the care of child, youth and family were in greater risk of experiencing a number of adverse outcomes. So that's where you say, so it's children who are in contact with the authorities, basically. And then when you're going to talk to Māori children, what I want to know is, does that refer to Māori children who were in contact with the authorities?
No, I don't think so.
You think it's the general population?
That's my remembering of that research.
Okay, all right, thank you. And then I have one more question of a sort of higher order, and it came through the evidence of both of you, and that was the cost of providing care, particularly you, Professor Taryn Sweeney in New South Wales, the intervention at that very early stage, the very high cost of that, and the cost to our society of mental disorders. I know that neither of you is an economist, and I think we'll be looking for economic evidence in the course of our inquiry over the next few years, but do either or both of you want to comment on what you perceive as the best spend for New Zealand in this area? The beginning, start of the early intervention, or at the outcome end?
Colleagues of mine at Oxford University have developed a tool actually that can be used for this. It's a cost calculator that can be used in child welfare services, and you can actually pop in different numbers into this calculator, and it can actually show you how much money interventions cost, for example, with a child with high levels of mental health needs in care at a certain age, and what you actually gain in terms of economic benefits to the state through that person's lifetime. And so their research has shown, using real examples and using this calculator, has actually provided practical proof, I guess, that intervening early with effective, I think the emphasis is on effective interventions, effective services, not only does it save lots of money for the state, but it, there's incalculable savings in terms of the human side, in terms of what.
Did you want to add anything to that, Dr. Rapsey?
Yes, so my understanding is that Treasury has already calculated the cost of care, and so I could provide you, I can't remember what the numbers are, but you can, of course, draw conclusions from what we have presented, that the cost of later incarceration, the cost of later involvement with child protective services, there is a substantive cost associated with care, and so the former government's focus on a social investment model work done at that time did generate an estimate of what being in care cost compared to not, and part of the work that we're planning in terms of looking at these intensive family preservation interventions, which are costly interventions, do they work out cheaper in the long term? And the other piece of evidence that I could direct you to is to that 2015 investigation into child, youth and family. I'm fairly sure that they have a table that details the cost benefit of particular interventions early on to prevent child maltreatment, and certainly significant savings can be achieved by intervening early and intensively.
Well, thank you both very much. I'm sorry to have ended on that rather on the economic note, which I hope doesn't take away from the fact that your evidence has been very powerful in terms of showing us the dramatic and negative effects of the children in care of the treatment that they've received. So thank you both very much.
Thank you. Ms. Alovivai.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Actually, that might be a nice segue into the systems question that I'd like to ask you both, if I may. I think, Professor Taryn Sweeney, there would be many NGOs out there and clinicians who would be feeling very vitriolic at your comments that actually often the answers lie, that it comes about through the practice that can then inform actually how they should be restructuring their programs, but it doesn't always fit the contract that they might have actually landed in terms of delivering a particular resource. My question really is around, in paragraph 35, Professor Taryn Sweeney, you refer to the strongest independent predictor of mental health is the age that the young person enters into care. And I know you referred to this too, Professor Rapsey. Regrettably for us, one of the things that we've come to know very well through the inquiry is that a lot of kids come in as infants and age out in care. And so the issue of placement then becomes very critical because in terms of looking at the systemic barriers, so we have lots of language in our different bits of legislation and our health legislation, MOE, social services, around being child-focused, doing things in the time frame of a child. Do you have any comments around actually where the nubs are that actually in that pipeline that actually need particular attention?
So when you were talking about nubs, do you mean with the...
There are some critical points. So when you talked about your nature versus nurture theory,
yes,
and you talked about attachment, the time frames around actually when babies need to really be placed either back
yes,
or into a kinship or a permanent caregiver. Yeah.
I think first of all that what I'm illustrating with this point about age at entry into care, it's not particularly pertinent to the idea that children are in care. Children who come into care at an earlier age are in better shape. It's more illustrative of the harm that happens cumulatively for children that are severely maltreated over time. And so all this is this is not an endorsement of out-of-home care. It's really shining a light on the fact that child protection services are increasingly focused on identifying severely maltreated as early as possible. And despite all of the current controversies, I believe that's the right approach. So that doesn't mean, however, that those children should come into care as infants and then grow up in care. I think pretty much everything that I'm saying suggests that either they need to be quickly returned to their families if they can safely care for them, or they should be raised by another family, or by extended family, by whānau, or by an unrelated family, but they shouldn't be spending their entire childhood as a case, right? So in terms of what your question is about, I think around what we're talking about, the developmentally sensitive timeframes and such. There's a different range of different opinions on this. All I can say is that the research tends to suggest that the incremental effects of maltreatment are linear. In other words, there's not like a particular, and that the first 3 to 5 years of life is when most of it happens. So if children are severely maltreated for more than 5 years and they're going into school, then often, even if they come into care, it's very difficult for those children to come back onto a normal life path. In terms of at what age children should be returned to their families, I think that's partly what you're referring to as well. I think this is where we need to be guided mainly by from attachment theory and very good assessment, individual assessments, rather than rules of thumb. And so I don't know if you saw the I'm a Survivor of State Care documentary of Darryl Brahms, but there was a particular placement that he had with the family, and he was moved from them, and he was still fairly young, and he'd endured some terrible, dreadful maltreatment in care prior to that. But for whatever reason, he had bonded to that family. So I think the important thing is not so much time, but it's the significance of the relationships. And so I think it's fundamentally wrong for us to be dragging children away from caregivers where they have bonded together very closely. That said, the younger children are, attachment theory tells us, the more malleable they are, the more capable they are of forming new attachments, and it's also driven partly by the amount of contact that they've had. So if they're being returned to their mother, then if they've been seeing their mother a lot so that they have an existing relationship that's being preserved, then they're not returning home to a stranger. And in turn, that's partly determined by memory. So the younger a child is, the shorter their long-term memory is. And so relationships are held in memories. So if you don't know who someone is, right, then you can't really have had a continuing relationship. As you get older, in your mind, you can kind of construct what appears to be a relationship, but in terms of a real relationship, that carrying someone in your mind and memory is important. And so that's why older children retain much longer memories of relationships then. I'm not sure if I've answered that.
No, you have.
Yeah.
The system systems issue that I'm referring to, that our survivors have been referring to throughout the stories that we've heard and what we've also heard in our private sessions, is exactly what you're describing. It's the inconsistent, there's just no attention paid actually to how they feel, to the removal. They say they like a caregiver, but they're removed anyway. So this is the policy work that's going on behind the scenes that is a bit incongruent.
So if you can imagine for a moment that your child or your grandchild had to live with someone else, right? But you were still concerned about where they were going to live with. You can imagine all the things you would be thinking about, right? But the state is a poor corporate parent, right? And this is notwithstanding the fact that we have so many wonderful social workers. The people that work in this field are so wonderful, and yet they're working within a system that shapes their thinking in ways where they intervene and make decisions that don't reflect what they would do if this was their own child or their own grandchild. In terms of funded services and funded agencies, I think if you read between the lines, or maybe it's even more explicit than that, I'm not advocating for services necessarily to be funded with more money. I'm advocating for the whole system to be basically closed down. And I know that privatisation of foster care services has actually led to an increasing powerful industry. And so what I'm proposing actually would be opposed by that privatised fostering services. What they would rather do is approach this from the point of view that it can be remedied. And what I'm trying to argue is that this system can't be remedied, it needs to be replaced. And so there are funded services that are, again, they're doing all of this for the right reasons. Their motivations are pure. But they will argue against what I'm arguing for, because it would, the ultimate end point of this would be that we would eventually replace care system with something else.
Thank you. That's what I was after. And Professor Rapsey, just your comment around the IDI, and so really they're kind of like the big dots that we look at, but obviously the qualitative data that you're referring to would be the small dots that then colour the journey and tell us. Is it about scale? Is that what you're referring to in terms of being able to explain the stories of the different cohorts of the different groups of families that you're working with? Yeah.
Is the question, like, why do we need that additional evidence?
Well, I know why we'd need it. It's to be able to tell the picture more clearly. But is it about scaling services? I was just wanting you to unpack that a bit more, if you were able to, please. Yeah.
I don't think I understand the question yet. Sorry.
So you've talked about your IDI, and
Yes.
you're waiting for that data.
Yep.
But you've also got some qualitative
Yes.
work that you're wanting to match it up with, or be able to tell the story in those big dots. Can you explain what you'd like to see come out of that, I guess is what I'm really asking. Yeah.
Okay, so yes, so we've got qualitative data, we've analysed that, we've done that part of the study, but that's only a small, it's a certain type of evidence, and it's only a small part of, it's only the people who are in the service right now. And so ideally, we want to know what the outcomes are of all of the children who have participated over time, but actually what's really required is a bigger study which actually assesses the outcomes of the children going into the future. Yeah, so it assesses their mental health, assesses their behaviour, assesses their attachment, and measures accurately how things are when they go in and how things are when they go out and over time.
Okay, great. Thank you. No further questions. Yeah.
Mr. Gibson.
Thank you both for your evidence. I'll start a question to Professor Tarrant Sweeney. The first part of it, you talked about 25% of those going into state care were people with children with intellectual disabilities, some language difficulties. and it's 2% of the general population. So it's not just an overrepresentation, it's in the order of 12 times what you'd be expecting. I suppose first, I imagine it's complex what's going on, but what's your sense of what's going on for that scale of these people to be coming into state care? And second to both of you, is there any difference in the evidence of the journey to recovery wellbeing for this group of people that have gone through care?
There hasn't been, to my knowledge, good research on trying to drill down and identify the reasons for this. We know that the type of intellectual difficulties is much more likely to be verbal difficulties and language-based difficulties. And there's a fairly simple causal mechanism that counts for that for maltreated children, and that is social neglect and understimulation in infancy. So children acquire verbal intelligence and acquire language and learn to speak because they're spoken to, and they are. It's through our social discourse and social interactions that we acquire language. And so you see, for example, extreme examples of this if we look at research on infants that are raised in orphanages in Eastern European countries. The very famous study of the English-Romanian adoption study of children that were experiencing very profound neglect in orphanages where they were left in their cots for most of the time. Almost all of those children had some level of intellectual disability, and yet there was no kind of underlying genetic or biological reason for that. In other words, the evidence suggests it was almost entirely due to their social developmental experiences. The other reason that I suspect, again, there's not a lot of research done on this, but I suspect the other main contributing factor to this is prenatal exposures to alcohol and other substances, particularly fetal alcohol effects. We know that there are quite well known effects on children's intellectual development. That's the only two main ideas that I have. Sorry.
And to you both, is there any difference in the journey to recovery, the evidence around that for this group? In my study, intellectual disability was one of the independent predictors of children's mental health. So in other words, we know that children in care with intellectual and language difficulties are more likely to have mental health problems than other children in care, but we don't know how to explain that relationship. It may just be that children that experience the most severe maltreatment manage to get doubly disadvantaged in terms of more likely having mental health problems and having language problems.
I don't know whether to add to that with a story. It's not research based. I had the coincidence of assessing a young person when they were, or seeing them and spending time with their foster parent. They'd been in foster care for the first two to 3 years of their lives, and they were developing typically and doing well. And then they returned to a maltreating environment, and I got to see them again when they were 7 or 8. And at that time, they had lost all of the language that they were developing. They had almost not really able to communicate, and had developed a number of behavioural and extensive difficulties that were now irreparable. So there are crucial periods where remaining in a maltreating environment that sets the course for the rest of the life of that young person.
Would it be right to assume that there's, I suppose, strong evidence, fertile ground that there should be a lot more early support pre-state intervention, whether it's clinical or social or other, for this group of people in particular who seem to be overrepresented in coming into the system.
Yes, I would certainly argue for that. I think, keeping in mind what Professor Sweeney said about the need for intervention sitting there alongside the need for intervening and keeping families together. There's a need for both of those, but certainly to intervene with families to address care and protection concerns would be invaluable. Do you add to that?
Yep. I think it's pretty clear if we look in Scandinavia, for example, that if you apply a population-wide family support and family preservation approach, in other words, across the larger number of families where children are known to child protection services, that has effects that are positive effects in terms of not just family preservation, but children's well-being and development. So that's kind of like a public health approach, where basically across the board we up the ante in terms of providing support and interventions that can improve family functioning and reduce the need for child protection services. But I think with this particular population of children in care, as I said before, these are the kids at the top of the pyramid. And in this situation, generic family support services and generic interventions are not going to work. We're not even, at this stage, we don't really have good confidence yet that we have interventions that do work for those families. My colleague at Canterbury University, Sarah Whitcomb-Dobbs, is just finishing a doctoral study on this topic. And one of the things that she's done is really quite a detailed review of the effectiveness of parenting interventions for the highest risk families, and measuring effectiveness in terms of reduced child protection notifications after the intervention. And the review doesn't really provide or yield many promising studies yet. So that's not to say we should be giving up on this. I think if society has, if there is a big goal for governments, rather than sort of shooting for the moon and trying to land a man on the moon, if we could solve this problem of how to repair families at the highest risk families so that children don't come into care, then that should be something that the Nobel Prize is given to. But so this is, this is the interminable problem. This is the human condition we're trying to deal with, this problem. So we have a situation there, I think, of simultaneously trying to. I think one of the problems that governments have got is just referring every family to whatever the service is that's available. And we know that for our highest risk families, that's not going to work. They actually need very, very targeted, very specific services. And even in that situation, there's no guarantee that it will work. But at least if we try it, we can, for the ones where it works, then it works. And for the ones where it doesn't work, we know what we have to do in terms of protecting the children. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Taryn Sweeney and Dr. Rapsey. This is bleak territory, but if I may say so, your written briefs, which have been well integrated by Mr. Merrick, and the generous and frank way in which you have answered the many questions we have put, have brought considerable clarity to what we have in front of us. But it doesn't diminish in any way the bleak picture that we look at regarding our country. The Commission is very grateful for the evidence that both of you have given. Thank you.
We are the